And how old you were when you were born?
Well, I was born east of Rockford, about 5 miles, and of course, 1914, November 27th. And I have a card at home that my sister sent to my grandmother. And believe it or not, she said, we have a fat boy born here, and he just sleeps and sleeps. Well, that didn't last too long. I never was fat, and I wasn't too good at sleeping, but I was better at crying. Anyway, we lived at this place until 1920, and I just barely remember the farm. My father bought the farm. Of course, he never got it paid for. It was during the war times. The prices were high. This World War One, and I don't. We had 4 mules, but I don't remember the mules. It just doesn't make an impression. But he sold them during the war, about 1918. So I was only about 4 years old, and I don't recall that. But Hazel used to drive the team called Kate and Barney on the, we have what they call the hay cart. He would pull the rope, and they would pull uh, the hay fork with a bundle of hay on it from the wagon up into Haymow. But I did that later on with horses, but I didn't remember that. I do remember my older brother, who was my only brother living at that time, 21 years older than I. He was almost drafted into the war, World War One. And I remember when he was out one Sunday morning, and you know how kids are, they always like to kind of tease and talk about things that, you know, people don't like to talk about too well. I remember of asking him on a Sunday morning out there, once he was polishing the brass, he always liked to keep the Oakland looking real good. Why didn't you want to go to war? I remember he had a folder with a canvas. It was green, olive green canvas and toothbrush holder and so forth, all his toiletries. But I remember that. But he did not have to go to war because being in agriculture, he was exempt because of a critical need of farm help. But I remember asking him, why didn't you want to go to war? But you know how kids are. I must have been, we got the Studebaker in 1919 or 20, 1918 or something in there. Well, he got the Studebaker after the Rio. The Rio.
What was the Studebaker? What?
Studebaker was a big 7-passenger touring car. Oh. So it was before that. So anyway, it must have been.
You had that on the farm?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know.
It was bought second-handed. It was right after. It was 1917 model. Probably got it in 18. So I was only about 4 years old. I just barely remember.
Did your mother ever drive?
Oh no, my mother never did drive.
And your father was still alive?
Yes. Oh yes. My father lived until 1937.
Right. He drove.
Oh yes.
Yeah. Did you kids drive on the farm?
Oh yes. I learned to drive in them. I remember I was 12 years old and I could drive the Ford, Model T Ford, but not alone. Beg your pardon?
I didn't know you had a car on the farm.
Oh yes. We got the first Rio before 1917. I don't know. It was an early model. Hand crank. Had acetylene lights. Did not have batteries. No generator.
And this was Rockford?
Rockford, Iowa.
Okay.
So in the spring of 1920, we moved to Rudd. And I did not go to school that year. Beulah was in the first grade. And I didn't start to school till 1921. So all through school, I can always remember what class I was, at what age, but the year. Because like in 1921, I was first grade and on up
7
to...
years old.
That's... It must have been, yes. I would be 7 years old later on that year because my birthday being before school started, after school started. So we moved to Rudd, and I went through all the grades in high school, all the grades in school, 11 grades.
So you say you moved to Rudd?
Yes.
The farm?
Yes, always lived on a farm.
You were renting a farm in Rudd?
Yes. After that, we've always rented farms. The only farm that my father bought, of course, he wasn't able to carry through the high prices during the World War One to pay for the house, and had to pay for the farm. Had to sell it again. Anyway, we always lived on rented places. But I went to school in Rudd for 11 years. Only exception was 1 year in Rockford. So,
And then, so you had most of your schooling there in Rudd.
that's right.
Right? And where is that in relation to Rockford? How far?
It's about 7 miles between Rudd and Rockford. Now the schools are combined. At that time, each school was a consolidated school, had their own grade school and high school. Now in recent years, Rockford, North Springs, and Rudd combined their schools, and they had one central high school. Another place, I think Marble Rock was in that too. They'd have a high school one place, and maybe the grade school another place, and they'd bus everybody in. So it was a different arrangement than what I grew up in.
Did you have several grades in one classroom when you were
Yes,
growing
in
up?
high school we had 4 grades
In one room?
in one room. Of course, that was just assembly hall. We went from there, of course, to like the classrooms.
What about in grammar school?
In grammar school, we had the first year I was in grade school, intermediate, 5th grade. We had 4 classes, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th, in one big assembly hall. The noisiest place you ever heard.
And that's for all your classes?
No, from there we went to classrooms.
Oh.
Classrooms from the assembly hall.
Individual grades, first, second,
Yes.
third?
Well, I'm talking about the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th. Yes. And then they had 1st and 2nd grade was in one room, 3rd and 4th in another room.
Now, how many in a school that size?
Uh,
Ballpark.
most of the classes were less than 20. Our class in high school, for instance, was 21 or 2, and that was one of the largest classes all through grade
This
schools.
was from farms all around the
That
surrounding
is
area,
correct. They
as
had,
well as Rudd.
that's right.
How big was Rudd, the town of Rudd?
Rudd was 429 people. The school bus went around and picked up different routes. And in the early days, they had horse-drawn buses. And,
Were you living at that time?
oh yes, I rode in a school bus with a horse-drawn
right?
buses. Yes, indeed. Very cold in wintertime. Now, some of the buses, they take the wheels off and put them on a sled.
Yeah.
And then other times, it was an awkward, and the buses tend to tip over very easily to being heavy. So, a lot of times they would just take a wagon box and put the sled underneath that and bundle the kids up in blankets and charcoal burning foot warmers, and it was much safer and faster. But some of the roads were so bad, they'd have to open up the field. They were low, and the snow drifting over the groves would cover the road, and they'd have to open up the fence and go along in the fields. Many, many times the roads had the most snow on them. And of course, in later years they'd plow them out, but the road being low, it would fill up with snow, and they'd have to open the gates and fences and use the fields to bypass the road that was clogged with snow.
So you graduated from what high school?
Graduated from Rudd High School in 1932.
Yeah. And you enjoyed what classes particularly?
Oh, I liked the manual training class the first year in high school. I liked physics. I enjoyed math too. I liked algebra, and
You did well, didn't you? Grade
yes.
Remember what your grade point average was?
No, but I was a valedictorian in
You
our
were the
class.
valedictorian?
Oh yes.
I don't think I ever heard you say that.
Well, I'm not bragging about it.
Well, never too late.
I always made the honor roll,
Yeah. So you had probably all B's and A's.
I guess.
Or did you have B's and A's? Did they,
Yes, we did.
Is that the kind of
Yes.
grading system?
Even I went to Rockford School. The fellow always the head of the class, and I wasn't ambitious to exceed him. Bud Hubbard, he was a friend of mine, but I beat him in grade point average, 5th and 6th grade.
But all throughout this time, you were pretty busy on the farm, too.
Oh, indeed.
You couldn't just study all day long.
Well, get home at night, 4 o'clock, school was out. You have chores to do, of course.
Such as?
Such as, you have to get hay down off in the mow for the horses and cows. You had to get bedding in. Maybe not having it in the barn, you'd have to go out to the haystack, the straw stack, and cut some and carry it in for the bedding, of course. And then a lot of times my father wouldn't have time in the morning to clean the barns, get all the refuse out. I'd have to help clean the barns and get all the manure outside, and then bed it, and then help milk the cows. But you know the best thing about farm life, the 2 best things. One thing is, if you worked, you always had plenty to eat. We always had a garden. We butchered our own meat. We had our own milk and butter. Our garden, we canned vegetables. We learned to work without a fear. You took it for granted. You, you're just, you grew up with the idea that no work, no eat. Anyway, that was one of the best things. You didn't go hungry, and you learned to work. In this modern day and age, it's so easy for kids to be pampered, sheltered, fed with a silver spoon. They don't know what hardship, they don't realize what it takes to put that bread on the table, and the idea of work. In some cases, the kid thinks that's one of the worst things in the world you have to do is any manual labor. That's a wrong way to grow kids up. That's why a farm is good, to teach kids to work.
But the bad side.
And you work collectively too.
But the bad side.
Yes.
Since you left the farm was.
The bad side? Well, it was wasted time. I spent 8 years out of high school when I should have been going on.
You're saying after you graduated from high
That's
school,
right.
8 more years.
8 more years just down the drain as far as getting ahead.
Were you the only one, you and your mother?
That is correct.
On the farm? At what point in time?
I graduated in 32. My father lived only 5 years after that, passed away in 37.
And he wasn't able to help much in the farm?
Well, he was 74 when he passed away, and once you get past 70, you just don't do a full day's work like a 50-year-old man. And no way could I leave and go to school in the Depression years. 32 on up to 38 was very bad Depression years. So no choice, but I had to stay and help.
What took your father?
He had pneumonia, got a bad cold, and before we knew it, he had pneumonia. He was only sick about a week. They did not have the miracle drugs like penicillin, and my sister, who was a nurse, came home, gave him the best of care, but in a week's time he was gone.
And
So
anyway, for 8 years you slaved,
yes.
helping your mother,
Yeah.
breaking your back, picking corn, so forth. Were you picking corn by hand?
Oh, absolutely.
And all those years?
We did hire some corn picker to come in because we just had too much acreage to do by hand.
Did you have?
Well, I usually had between 50, 60 acres of corn. I've
What
had,
else did you harvest?
beg your pardon?
What else did you harvest?
Oh, well, of course, we had our small grain, like oats with some wheat in it. And that was sown early in the spring and ripened in July. Cut it with a binder. The binder put it into bundles. Then we'd have to shock it up with about seven bundles, counting the cap, to shelter it till it dried out dry enough to thrash. And maybe you sit there 2 weeks, depends on the weather, and then we had a thrashing ring. One man would operate the separator, which was a thrash machine, another man would operate the steam engine or gasoline power to drive the mechanism, and they'd have about 8 men with teams of horses and a bundle wagon, which is a hay rack. Go out and haul the bundles in, pitch them into the bundle, into the bundle trough, and it went in the thrash machine, separated the grain from the straw, blew the straw up in a straw stack. And I pitched many and many, many bundles. Hard work, but it was kind of fun.
You accomplished something at the end of those days.
There's a kind of a camaraderie that came
Sure.
with
That you don't have nowadays in town.
yes, with the thrashing crew, and always they'd have real good meals and
Yeah. And you slept well at night.
oh yes.
Yeah. Did you have much to sell at the end of a season or a growing season? Did you
course.
sell to town?
We sold not too much grain. We sold mostly the corn. We sold mostly the hogs that used mostly corn for fattening and finishing off, and have some cattle.
Hog
and
was your main
yes, and then
saleable item.
yes, we had dairy cattle, of course. We'd milk the cows, and we'd sell the cream. Cream truck would come around and collect the cream. We'd have a separator, a hand crank separator. We'd separate the milk from the cream from the milk. We'd feed the skim milk to the hogs and chickens, and the cream, they would take it and they test it for butter fat, and pay you according to what percent you have of the pounds they weighed each time. And between that and money from the eggs, we'd take in to the grocery store and trade for groceries, and we'd have some cash left over. That was our sole source of cash throughout the year. Of course, selling the hogs in the fall and winter, ready for market, 200 to 275, maybe 300 sometimes. That was our sole. No, pounds per animal. I remember in the Depression, a 200-pound hog would bring $4.80, $2.20 a pound. $2.20 a 100 pound. Oats was 8 cents a bushel. Corn got down to 10 cents a bushel.
How much is a bushel?
A bushel? Well, I don't know. I can't tell you how many cubic inches it is.
Is it half a garbage can full, or?
About.
Really?
Yeah, it'd be about.
Yeah. Just to give you some idea.
For instance, you take 60 pounds of potatoes, you'd have a bushel. 60 pounds of wheat, you'd have a bushel.
Okay, well, let's...
Okay.
While you were working on the farm alone after you had graduated, what started to get you into the idea of aviation industry?
My father passed away in 37, and I farmed for 4 years after that for my mother. I was never cut out to be a farmer. I didn't like that 7 days a week, 365 or 52 weeks a year, chores. You're tied down. Didn't like the cold weather in winter and the difficult heat in the summer. So I was out picking corn one day, I remember, in about 1938. Picked by hand, open pollinated corn, small irregular ears, poor soil, poor crops. And I just said to myself, I was very dissatisfied. What am I doing this for? Isn't there something better? And I always liked to work around mechanics. In fact, I built a garden tractor out of some old scrap single-cylinder engine that was thrown away, some old pump jack gears and Model T Ford wheels. And it was fun. It worked. It would dig itself down. It had that much power. Anyway, I thought, I just don't want to do this. Most of your labor was so burdensome, hard hand work. Now it's mechanized all the way. So I got to thinking, I was picking corn that day. Isn't there a better way? And I thought about the auto mechanics because I liked to work on cars at that time. I couldn't see working on a dirty car all the time. And I thought about aviation. I investigated. I remember I went to Mason City and hung around the airport once in a while. I had a chance and talked to people there, small airplanes. So I started writing and get some information and decided to go to aircraft school. And I was very fortunate in selecting a good school in Los Angeles, California Flyers, and it was a real good school. I went 1 year and got both my aircraft and aircraft engine mechanics license.
How did you afford that?
The tuition was $450
A year?
A year. And my mother and I were living together at that time. And we were managing an apartment, so we got our rent free. And after selling all of her equipment, she had some money. And I had to borrow a little bit, but I paid her right back since I went to work. Anyway, we were able to make it. And I worked out part of my tuition. Washing windows, sweeping the hangar floor, so forth. And I went to school 1 year, and that was the best thing I ever did.
Mm-hmm. That was a 1-year course?
Yes. I went 1 year. Most of the schools, you were not qualified to have sufficient experience to qualify for taking your exam. But California Flyers was a good school. We worked on airplanes that were actually in service because they had a flight school. And we built wing panels and ribs and dope and fabrics. We learned that, and welding and so forth. So we got adequate experience, and I got both my licenses after 1 year.
This was 1938?
No, this was 1940 and 41.
40, 41.
I finished school. I started in school the last few weeks of December 1940. and finished school right after Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. And it was the best thing I ever did was get my license at that time.
And so then you started working
I went to work for Lockheed, and they required,
in Southern California.
that's correct,
What was the
Burbank,
In Burbank?
Burbank, California.
Yeah.
Anyway, they required they have licensed mechanics to run up the engines on the Vega Ventura. Was a twin-engine medium bomber, and that was my first job as run-up mechanic. 2,800 Pratt & Whitney engines. They started out 1,850 horsepower and later on up to 2,000 horsepower.
And how were you trained for that job?
Well, mostly it was a rush deal after the war broke out. There were a few fellows who worked for the airlines, and we had the basic knowledge but the experience. We learned it from lead men that were good.
On the job?
That's right, on the job.
Yeah.
We took the airplanes coming out of the factory. The engines were all preserved. They had preservative spark plugs in them, and we had to take those plugs out, put regular spark plugs in, and set all the pressures, fuel pressure, check the oil pressure, high and low oil pressures, vacuum pressure, and fuel pressure, all those things had to be set. And then the airplane went up for a test hop.
And how do you remember liking that way of life?
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it very much.
You thought you were really, now you were getting somewhere.
Yes, but I only worked there 8 months. In 1942.
Do you remember what you were being paid at the time?
I started out for 86 cents an hour with both my licenses.
Was that considered, how was that considered?
That was about all the aircraft factories and industries were paying at that time. I gradually worked up. I was making over $1. Then, three of us mechanics that were licensed mechanics, we heard about in San Diego, Consolidated Voltique Corporation. They were building airplanes, and they were hiring crews, flight crews. And so we went down there to be interviewed on a weekend.
Down where?
To San Diego, Consolidated Voltique in San Diego. They said they couldn't hire us, but if we were out of work, we would be qualified. So we got release, went to work in August 42 for Consolidated Voltique. That was the best job I had during the war.
And what did you do?
I worked at the factory. First, we had to learn the airplane. We'd go out with a run-up crews and made some tours through the factory. We didn't work at the factory. We were on the flight line, flight crews. Flight engineer had to learn all how they set up these pressures and so forth, and how they made their test runs, and prepared the airplane for test hop and delivery. And then, as we worked up, we'd go up on what they call a shakedown flight. The airplane, at that time, we were taking up to 25,000 feet. We had to have oxygen and test everything and write up all the discrepancies, come back in. The airplane would be corrected, the mistakes and errors, and put into shape for delivery. And then we deliver the airplane quite often to Davis-Monthan Field over in Tucson, Arizona. The Army had a modification center there where they made additions and corrections, and their particular configuration was kept changing all the time. So we delivered the airplane over there to Tucson. Sometimes we had to deliver 2 airplanes a day. Go over there, deliver the airplane, ride back, take another one over there and deliver it.
How much were you making then?
I think I started out first 150 a month, I think. Well, in each airplane you got checked out on, you got another $50 raise. Anyway.
And so you were there how many years?
I was at the factory for a little over a year. And delivered some airplanes, one to Key West, Florida, one to Honolulu, a couple to Elizabeth City, North Carolina. This was all military, of course, during the war. And then I got on what they call the West Run. This was Air Transport Command employed Consolidated Voltique crews to fly mail and passengers to Australia, Guadalcanal, New Guinea, all in the South Pacific during the war. So I applied for that and got on the run. And I did that from 43 till the end of 45. That was a very interesting run. I was making $300 a month base pay. We get 2/3 our base pay per trip. I was making between $600 and $700 a month by flying a trip and a half a month to Australia and back, or the equivalent. Sometimes we make 3 shuttle trips to Honolulu, and that would be equivalent to a round trip. I remember $75 bonus round trip to Honolulu. Make 3 trips, it was about equivalent to Australia and back.
Sounds rather interesting.
It was interesting for a farm boy.
Yes, yes. And then something happened in 44. You were still working for this company in 44 when you were.
That's correct.
What happened in 44?
Well,
What brought?
I kind of lost track of a certain person, Evelyn Wadsworth, and through a friend of mine, he told me where she was. And so I started corresponding with her. First thing you know, interesting correspondence, and we had met, of course, but I took her home, I guess, a few times, but nothing really serious. But I never really dreamed I could rate her, but fortunately we got very attached to one another, and we were married in 1944, June the 25th, 1944.
And you were still working in the same company?
That is correct. I worked up to get enough time so I had time off and flew back there. She had a car. We loaded it down with all the gifts and our own personals and drove to California. That was our honeymoon, 1944.
And then you settled?
We lived. I had an apartment rented. Apartments were very hard to get. We had kind of a penthouse apartment at the top of it was the 3rd story of a big old building. It was pretty warm up there in summertime, but we were thankful to have it.
What was the town?
In Sacramento, California.
Right. Now were you still working for the same company?
Oh yes, yeah.
Even though you were relocated? You just kept flying out of, you were working out of Southern California.
Okay.
Right?
I didn't explain that. For a long time, we were ferrying the airplanes and the personnel from San Diego to Hamilton Field near San Rafael. The government frowned on that. It was just too far to go. So they said the personnel would have to move to Fairfield. It was called at that time Fairfield Suisun Air Base near Fairfield. Now it's called Davis. It's called, I can't think of the name now.
You'll think of it later.
Yeah, anyway. So they made the personnel move up to Fairfield. And being close to Sacramento, I could always get back out and forth the field in time for my duties. So we lived in Sacramento. We bought our first house there and moved in May the 1st, 1945.
And so you were still working for this company?
That is correct, till the end of 45.
45.
After the war was over, end of 45, an aircraft manufacturer cannot operate an airline. It is against all the rules. It would be a monopoly for a manufacturer to own an airline and operate it. And of course, it wasn't legitimately an airline. It was just a contract airline working for the Air Transport Command. So, for a few months, I worked for a crop duster in Sacramento. And then, along about March, a bunch of the fellows and personnel that were pretty high up in, we call it Conserway, which was the name of the branch of Consolidated that flew for the Air Transport Command. They got together and formed a corporation called, well, I'll think of that too pretty soon. And they got a contract with the Air Transport Command to fly military to Honolulu, to Tokyo. So I flew about seven or nine trips to Tokyo and back. They still had the contract, ATC contract. And then the competition got increased, and the Flying Tigers at that time won the contract at a lower rate. So we were all furloughed. But I did work for them in not Upland, but Ontario, California. They were modifying C-54s to make them, bring them up to commercial standards to use for commercial use. They were military airplanes, they had to have a lot of modifications. So I worked there about 8 months, helping to convert these airplanes. They would convert them and then sell them to different airlines, different companies. But things got pretty slow, and I was laid off in September of 1947. So
That's the first job you'd ever been laid off?
that's the first job I ever got laid off.
Yeah.
I think I collected 1 week of unemployment, $20. That's all I collected.
Because you went where?
I took an offer, which wasn't too brilliant, working for Aircraft Service Corporation in Fresno on small airplanes.
Why wasn't it so brilliant?
Well, it's a very insecure job. Worked 6 days a week, no time clock, no overtime, no retirement plan, no group insurance, no benefits.
So you knew about that before you took it?
Yes.
Wasn't too much available at that time?
I should have gone with the airlines then. I could have gone with United, I'm sure, at that time, but I wasn't very smart. I woke up finally. At the end of the first year, I knew I had made a bad choice because the field was not, it didn't hold very much future. A lot of hard work and no security. So I finally got my vacation scheduled so I could come up, and in 1950, I applied to United, passed their test, went to work for them October 1950.
What kind of tests were they?
Oh, they give you just sort of a sanity test. Along with, I had to do some handwork too, showing what I could do, following prints, making things. In other words, how my mechanical skills were. I passed the test with no problem.
I was just curious, when you talked about on the farm that you were interested in mechanical things.
Yes.
Since obviously you have that in your genes, so to speak, and Roger has that. Did your father have that? Where do you think you got it? Was it your mother's side?
From my mother's side.
Your mother was
Yes. Her brothers were all very clever with their hands, mechanics. Art, I'm not endowed with that, but Uncle Brent and Uncle Raleigh and Uncle Bert were all very good with their hands, making things, blacksmith and machinery.
What was your father's side niche more?
His father was highly respected in the community. He was very civic-minded.
Whose father? Exactly?
My father's father.
Your grandfather?
Yes. He was very good at, they call him judge, I believe. I can't remember just what they did call him now. But he was highly respected in the community. Civic-minded and a good leader. My grandfather passed away when my father was very young, and he was actually raised by his uncle, I believe.
Oh, okay, so that brings us then to 1947 when you started working for United?
In 1950.
1950.
I started working in Fresno in 1947, worked there 3 years.
Okay. All right.
I learned a lot about small airplanes and really perfected my hand skills, such as welding, pick up a torch every day, that's so I could run a good bead.
At Fresno?
At Fresno.
I see.
And really learned a lot about airplanes that you don't learn in the book. You have to work at it.
You moved from Sacramento to
Ontario, Upland, California.
Ontario area. And there to Fresno.
That's correct.
And then while you were working for United, actually you moved then to
Menlo Park.
Menlo Park.
Right.
And took your job in San Francisco.
That
South
is
San
correct.
Francisco.
Yeah, that's where I worked for 29 years and 2 months.
Right.
San Francisco maintenance base.
And you started out as?
A mechanic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Remember what you were making an hour?
Less than $2. They just got a raise. It was $1.75 or 85, something like that. Yes.
And you were a mechanic working what shift?
I was working, of course, graveyard shift for quite a little while.
You had to take that.
You have to take the lower shift to you build up enough seniority, and I hired in at a very good time, though. They were just beginning to hire. Every year when things would slow up, they would quite often have a layoff. In 1948, United Airlines had a big layoff, mechanic-wise. Those were all called back, of course, when I came back in 50. But they were just starting to hire, But they hired many, many people after that. So I got in at a good time, and I wasn't on graveyard too long. In fact, I was only a mechanic for a little over 6 years. And then I applied for inspection work, and I worked about 23 years as an inspector.
I see.
It paid a little more money, more responsibility, but it was a little more prestigious job, and it was cleaner work.
Did you get that based on a test or seniority?
Oh, you have to pass a test, yes, both written and they give you a test of inspection. A little bit tricky and all that, but it isn't beyond a person's ability to prove that they...
You were good in school, so that
Yeah.
helped.
But they paid more money, naturally.
Yeah.
But it took the airlines a long time to get geared to the type of pay, for instance, that building trades were making almost double we were in 1966. We had our first strike in 66. The airlines were paying $3.20 an hour for mechanics.
Was United unionized when you first started?
They had a union, but it wasn't what you call a union shop. You didn't have to belong to it. But later on they voted a union shop. In other words, if you're going to work there, you had to join the union. So it's a necessary evil to have a union, because these big companies will not take care of their employees, most of them, unless they have to. Only if they all they can see is dollar signs.
And so you were, of course, you were renting in Menlo Park, right?
We
Or
bought
did you own that house?
we bought the house.
You bought Fresno as well, right?
Yes,
And Upland.
that's right. And Sacramento.
You mostly bought then, didn't you?
Yes, we did.
I see. Right. But then you had enough money when you came to Mountain View to buy a new home.
It was a real struggle. We had to we sold our house at no profit, since the ethnic grew less money total than what we paid for it, but we lived there almost 4 years. So when we bought a new house in Mountain View, I didn't make enough money to really qualify for the loan, but by borrowing on insurance, wringing the rag out real tight, we just barely made it to qualify. And it was a good thing we bought when we did, because it's gone up now from $15,400 we paid for it till it's slightly under $200,000 valuation now.
What year was it you bought it?
We bought in 1954, moved in February 17th, 1955. And next spring it will be 30 years.
That was the first home you'd ever had to put in patios and the lawn.
That's
and all
correct.
That, wasn't it?
That is
It was
correct.
quite an adventure, I'll bet.
Yes.
And a lot of work, taking care of a family and working. I think you were working swing shift and graveyard, weren't you? In those
Yes.
days? And managing the planning of the new house and all that.
I wonder
You
now.
were busy.
I wonder now how I did it,
Well, you were
because I was younger than I am now.
Yeah.
But I'm glad that we moved. I'm glad we made the change. I'm glad I don't have to do it all over again.
And you retired in what year?
I retired in December 1st, 1979, which will soon be 5 years.
And that was, as you said, after 29 years?
29 years and 2 months.
No.
But
Did you
United...
enjoy your retirement?
And very much, very much. I enjoyed working there. And of course I enjoyed the fact that they really sincerely asked me, wouldn't you like to stay on? Of course they probably had to, because they couldn't retire you because you were 65, forcing that as an issue. I said, no way, I would like to just retire and start collecting.
And your favorite hobbies are?
Oh, I like to garden, and I like to put around the shop. I like to try to keep things fixed up and painted up, and in operation, and
But your biggest hobby, of course, is the rose garden,
I enjoy the roses very much.
which I would like to get some pictures of those rose gardens one of these days.
Sure.
Maybe it'd be better to do it in the spring.
October would be one of the good
Would it?
times.
October?
October is one of the best months.
We'll have to plan to do that.
Yes.
That would be very nice. I'd like to, in fact, I'd like to get a view of the house and the outside, front, and so forth. It'd be fun to play these tapes 20 years from now.
Okay.
You may be still here, but it'll be fun. Okay, I think the Olympics are going to start in about 25 minutes, so I better get Mom's point of view
Right.
on this tape.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Better cut it off.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay. Here's one more anecdote Dad wants to tell.
Well, I don't know how funny it is, but we always had a radio on the farm, either battery operated dry cell or a wet battery, 6 volt, like a car battery. Of course, you'd have to take the battery to town and have it charged. And so I got the idea in 1935 or 36. I think it was the winter of 36. Built a wind charger because they sold them, but we didn't have money. Zenith put out one, but we didn't have money to buy them. So I built one, and I didn't know how to wind the generator to make it charge at a lower speed. So I geared it up. I used a Model T front wheel and a Model A Ford timing gear, which drove the gear on the generator. Mounted it on top of our wood shed, made it so it'd swivel into the wind. We used that from 36 until 1940 for 4 years, and run the wire in and charge our radio battery. Wintertime we always had quite a bit of wind, and so it worked real good. In summertime I put a generator on the tractor, and we were cultivating in the fields, corn and so forth. It would charge the battery that way.
I'll be darned.
So
That was pretty ingenious.
I didn't have lights on the tractor, but the fellow that bought it at the sale in 1940, he put lights on it immediately. I had the generator on it and had the battery rack, and
Did you have electricity in the house that night?
no,
I wouldn't think so. If you did,
No.
you could have charged it that way.
that's correct.
When you didn't ever have lighting on the farm.
From this battery, I run wires up in the bedrooms,
Oh.
and I had each room had a 25 watt bulb.
As long as the wind was blowing, you're okay.
But I wasn't very smart. I learned a lot of things. The wire I used was too light. The resistance was too great. The battery was drained so much from the resistance of that wire, the bulbs were mighty dim. But it was enough to go to sleep by, but I learned.